Good evening. Welcome to tonight's program. My name is Cherry Link, and I am a board member of the Greater Lansing United Nations Association and the Peace Education Center, two of our sponsors today. We have other sponsors for tonight's show that I really want to thank, including the Islamic Center of East Lansing, Hazlitt Community Church, and Lattice. The more the merrier for this important topic. For many years, GLUNA has organized a program to celebrate and recognize Earth Day. This year's program was inspired by a combination of forces. One was the recent International Panel on Climate Change's sixth synthesis assessment report released in early March. The bottom line of that report was that if humans want to minimize the chance of ecological unraveling, we have only 80 months to reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. Note, that is a global reduction. Many in the human family, most especially in the developing world, are suffering the most and need to have their basic needs met by increasing energy consumption to eke out even a reasonable quality of life. That means that those of us in the developed world need to reduce our consumption even more to allow for some growth for others. How do we wrestle with these real concerns? We originally thought of showing a few short videos that address these issues, and in fact, we will gladly share towards the end of tonight's program some links to a few that we thought would highlight the range of possibilities that we should consider. But even as we were setting these up, I happened to stumble on a book in the MSU Library's new bookshelf that I happened to take home with a few others and opened it up one morning and started to read. It was Rogers' Politics and Spirituality, Essays on Religion, Environment, Disability, and Justice. It was clear early on that here was someone who has wrestled deeply and for a long time on these very issues. So we were incredibly excited that our outreach to invite him to speak was swiftly and warmly accepted. 2 weeks ago, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres visited Somalia to celebrate Ramadan. Guterres said, quote, "Somalia is suffering from an impact of a climate crisis it has done almost nothing to create, as a full-blown famine threatens to follow a drought that killed 43,000 there last year." Next slide. Last week, I was in email conversation with a dear friend of mine from Burkina Faso. Francois shared the following, quote, "Today, our big challenge is water access. It's difficult for people and animals to have access to water. The need for drillings is very important. I think if you want to do anything for us, is to help us have some boreholes for the water supply for the people and the animals," end quote. He noted also that growing terrorism there had curtailed another project that we had worked on together. Francois added, quote, "After the launch of the 1,000 bikes pilot project, we made 90 bikes available to women in rural areas on a trial basis. These 90 beneficiaries have to work to pay back the bikes in order to buy bikes for other women. Unfortunately, because of terrorism, women met some difficulties to reimburse, but we need to be patient with them," he said. It is clear that justice requires action. Tonight, we are so fortunate to have someone who has spent his adult life addressing our right relationships with the community of life. In my recent reading of his work, I sense that he evokes the spirit so effectively captured by the poet Denise Levertov in her poem, Beginners. This is that poem. "From too much love of living, hope and desire set free, even the weariest river winds somewhere to the sea. But we have only begun to love the earth. We have only begun to imagine the fullness of life. How could we tire of hope? So much is in bud. How can desire fail? We have only begun to imagine justice and mercy, only begun to envision how it might be to live as siblings with beast and flower, not as oppressors. Surely our river cannot already be hastening into the sea of non-being. Surely it cannot drag in the silt all that is innocent. Not yet, not yet. There is too much broken that must be mended, too much hurt we have done to each other that cannot yet be forgiven. We have only begun to know the power that is in us if we would join our solitudes in the communion of struggle. So much is unfolding that must complete its gesture, so much in bud. Next slide. Dr. Roger S. Gottlieb is the William B. Smith Dean's Professor of Philosophy at Worcester Polytechnic Institute and the author or editor of 21 books and more than 150 articles on environmentalism, religious life, contemporary spirituality, political philosophy, ethics, the Holocaust, feminism, and disability. He is internationally known for his work as a leading analyst and exponent of religious environmentalism, for his passionate and moving account of spirituality in an age of environmental crisis, and for his innovative and humane description of the role of religion in a democratic society. He has given keynote addresses and endowed lectures at universities and public settings in the US and Canada. His two fiction works, Engaging Voices and The Sacrifice Zone, won the Nautilus Book Awards. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Roger Gottlieb.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. Thank you for inviting me. Please let me know, anyone, if my voice isn't coming across clearly. If you will indulge me, I would like to begin, as I usually begin these things, by ringing a little bell. And I would ask you to gently let your eyes close and simply pay attention to your breath, the rise and fall of your chest, or the place at the base of the nose where breath enters the body. With each breath, we are connected to life. No breath, no connection, no life. As we come into the present, focusing on the breath, the past and the future can, if only for a moment, fade away, for you can only breathe in the present. Gently, slowly open your eyes. Okay, I will talk about a number of themes: the climate crisis, the environmental crisis, the content and origins of the idea of environmental justice, the relation of the environmental crisis to fascism, and I'll end with some difficult questions and also some suggestions about further action, as I'm sure people who would come to a program like this know. The climate crisis is the continuous pouring into our atmosphere, the transformation of our atmosphere into gases that warm the planet. The consequences of this global warming, the most rapid change of the climate in millions upon millions of years, are a number of severe difficulties. A lack of water in one place, too much water in some other place, acidification of the ocean, as 80 to 90% of the CO2 we produce is not in the atmosphere, it's in the ocean. Consequences of this for humans: we saw the hurricane in Katrina. For 5 days, thousands upon thousands of people without water, food, toilet paper, anything. In the richest country on earth, we somehow couldn't get anything to them. I wonder if their color had anything to do with that, the color of their skin, the racial makeup. You have people in the American West who must, beautiful areas out there. It's not that far from Michigan. Michigan's beautiful too. I went to summer camp there once. American West people, old colleague of mine who retired in Montana, he said he had to stay inside all summer long, couldn't go outside, couldn't hike, couldn't walk, because the smoke from the forest fires was too much. It's not just the burning of the forest, the pine bark beetle, which is encouraged to reproduce more and function more because of warmer, longer summers and milder winters is felling millions upon millions of trees in the national forests out there. You have heat so intense that people will not be able to work outside, whether it's in New Delhi or Phoenix, Arizona. You have parts of the world that are literally becoming unlivable, parts of Central America. That's one reason for the mass migration towards the United States. It's just too hot and there's not enough water. It's well known that the Syrian civil war was precipitated to some extent by drought in the rural areas, the influx of people into the cities, and social destabilization. United Nations estimates 3 to 6, sometimes 8, sometimes 10 million climate refugees per year. Future fears include a lack of water, the melting of the glaciers, wars over water, more further social destabilization. What will happen to the social supports in a country like the United States if you have 3 or 4 major hurricanes going up the East Coast, not hitting comparatively open areas like Vermont? I mean, it was terrible what the hurricane did to Vermont. I forget the name of it a few years ago, but nobody lives in Vermont, right? I go up there in the summertime from Boston and nobody lives there, so it doesn't attract much attention. But if you had hurricanes like that hitting Charlotte, Baltimore, Washington, New York, and Boston, the amount of damage that it would done, oh, we'd rebuild. But where would the money come from? Where would be the money for education, childcare, support for people with disabilities, support for the aged, healthcare? Where would the money come from? Ultimately, if it gets too hot and too dry, what are we going to eat? You can't eat oil. Can't eat plastic. So that's in a nutshell. Again, many of you probably know this, but I'm trying to focus your attention on it right now. That's the climate crisis. The climate crisis is part of a huge enveloping thing called the environmental crisis. It's climate and it's various kinds of insidious, globally distributed pollution. There, in 20 years, we have been told, there'll be more plastic in the ocean than fish. And this plastic isn't just sitting there looking unsightful, it's being ingested by all kinds of marine life. You can see pictures of birds, seabirds in tiny islands in the South Pacific. You cut them open, they have 200 pieces of plastic you can see, not microplastic, plastic you can see in their bellies because it's bright colored and they can't distinguish between the plastic and real food. It's not just in the seabirds, it's not just in the fish, it's in our bodies. Every human being alive now has plastic in their bodies, causing inflammation, the malfunction of various organs, and causing mental problems. Nanoplastic crosses the blood-brain barrier and has deteriorating effects on human health. Same thing goes with pharmaceutical products. There are 6 to 10 to 12 billion prescriptions filled every year. When you take a pharmaceutical, gabapentin, as I take for nerve pain, antihistamines, antidepressants, all kinds of things like that, your body only absorbs 50 to 20% of it. The rest you urinate out, goes into the toilet, goes into the water treatment, which doesn't have the ability to take it out of the water, goes into the water supply. The entire ocean, every bay, every ocean is being poisoned by our pharmaceuticals. Other things can be listed, but you get the point. We have written the mark of our civilization on this planet the way a graffiti artist writes on bridge supports. And what is it that we see? Incredible power, a scope never before realized by any dictator or authoritarian regime, could change the pH, the acidic level of the ocean, could make mother's milk unsafe to drink because of the interior of pollution of the mother's body. Nobody could ever do this in the past. We have done it in the last 40 to 50 years. A lot of fuss has been raised about the climate crisis with good reason. Yet we stand in a situation now where the major actors of climate, which are the major fossil fuel companies and the governments who support them, and the members of government who are all but, obviously employed by them in terms of campaign contributions, have not stopped, will not stop, unless dramatic action is taken. Last year, fossil fuel companies in the United States make 200 billion, with a B, billion dollars of profit. In the last, since the Paris Climate Accords, whatever that means, something like 1 to 3, I can never remember the number exactly because it's so large, 1 to 3 trillion with a T dollars have been used to finance fossil fuel companies. So the banks, the hedge funds and so forth, these massive supports of capital have not turned away from fossil fuel. That is what we're up against. And we know quite clearly that they know what's going on. Now, 35 years ago, the head of Exxon told the people of Exxon, make your shoreline installations tougher because the sea is going to rise and the storms are going to get worse. And they had a secret little email conversation, listserv, where they talked about it with phony names. They had made up anonymous names, talking about they knew global warming was coming. And at the same time, they hired a public relations firm to cast doubt on it. Well, it's not so clear. And tree huggers and, environmentalists are just really socialists who want more government interference. And of course, we can't do away with fossil fuels. What would we barbecue with our pickup trucks? And on and on and on. They did that intentionally, hiring, just as a matter of awful irony, the same public relations firm that was hired to cast doubt on the relation between smoking and cancer. This is what we're facing. Now, on the one hand, this is a civilizational crisis and tells something about our collective modern civilization and its relationship to the planet, to ourselves and the planet. And at the same time, there is this question of climate justice or environmental justice, which is the unequal relationship to this crisis, both as cause and to the victims of it. So there are concentrated forms of power and profit, which are getting rich off this, quite simply. There are people who are doing more or less okay in the developed nations and okay in the undeveloped nations who are comparatively wealthy, comparatively protected, liable to the problems, liable to the suffering. When the floods hit California, when the drought hits New Mexico or Arizona, the rich suffer along with the poor, but the poor suffer much more. The poor suffer, but they have fewer supports. They have less social capital to defend themselves against environmental problems of any kind. When something terrible happens to their neighborhood, as happened to New Orleans with a very high percentage of African Americans, the help is not forthcoming, or it comes very slowly, or it comes very inadequately. Somebody drew a cartoon and said, with a picture of the earth, saying, pretend I'm a bank and you can help me out. Pretend I'm a bank. You can bail me out. Okay. So I just want to tell, because it's interesting in terms of where one can go forward, the story of where the notion of environmental justice or environmental racism comes from. And interestingly, when I heard that one of the sponsors of this talk is a United Church of Christ congregation, because this has a lot to do with the United Church of Christ. So where did we get this notion of climate justice, environmental justice, the flip side of that, which is environmental racism? Where did the ideas come from? President Biden just passed an executive order that the government should take seriously the question of environmental racism or environmental justice in its policy moves. Where you build something, what you allow to be built, remedial efforts. Now, I forget where I read the story about this, which said that this was the first time any president had ever taken this kind of move. And of course, that's false, because President Clinton did it in the mid-90s. So where did this idea come from? If you look at writings about nature, if you look at proclamations from Earth Day, 1969, 1970, 1971, you don't see this mentioned. The notion that there are differential effects within the human community, that society is stratified by class, by race. The notion that this is something that environmentalists must take seriously, it wasn't part of the repertoire. It wasn't part of national parks, protecting the whales. It wasn't part of it. Where did it come from? Well, it started in North Carolina in a place called Warren County. This place called Warren County already had 3 toxic waste facilities. Toxic waste facilities are these huge operations with huge trucks rumbling down your roads, spilling stuff, fumes going into the air, runoff going into the water. It's horrible to have in your neighborhood. They had 3. State of North Carolina says, we got too much toxics here, honey. We got to burn up some more. Where should we put it? Warren County. Now, it was just surely an accident. Maybe they hadn't noticed that Warren County had the highest concentration, the highest percentage of people of color in the state. That's where the Black people live. So let's put another poisoning facility where they live. And they resisted. This was the first time they actually formally resisted. And they had marches and demonstrations and leaflets and lawsuits and civil disobedience. The great civil rights leader, John Lewis, who was in the Congress from Georgia, he came up, he was arrested, went to jail. It was a big deal. Who supported these people? Who printed the leaflets? Where did they have place to meet? It was the United Church of Christ. Out of this experience, people started to wonder, what's going on? Why would they put the 4th in a place where there are already 3? So they decided to do a little study, and they studied every county in the United States. And the study was published a few years later called Toxic Waste in the United States, big bound book, I have it on my bookshelf, which looked at every county and looked at toxic waste, incinerators, toxic facilities, petrochemical facilities, the whole gamut. And they came to the finding that if you were Black or brown, Hispanic or red, American Indian, you were much likely to be in an area that was polluted. The pollution was much less likely to be cleaned up. And the people who were polluting you were much less likely to be punished than if you were white. And this was even true, and the finding has continued to the present, if you were middle-class African American. On the basis of this finding, they organized the first comprehensive meeting of what they then called people of color environmental activists. They had about 500 or 600 of them, came to New York in 1989, 1990, and they wrestled with this experience. These were people both from the United States and also from the United States' island possessions in the Pacific. And they wrestled with the issues and their experience, and they came up with the principles of environmental justice. Interestingly, the first of those principles reads, we must respect the sacredness of Mother Earth. We must respect the sacredness of Mother Earth. Now, I had a conversation, I interviewed her for one of my earlier books, the Native American woman who wrote that. And she said, well, I had a little trouble with some of the Christians because it sounded too pagan, basically, for them. But we managed to do it okay. The principles of environmental justice then swept through both the American and the global environmental community. It is now spoken of everywhere that environmentalists talk, realizing that, yes, the fate of endangered species, elk or polar bears, is a terrible thing. But what about when you, human beings, when you are the endangered species? When the environmental problem is not in some faraway forest, it's on your street, where the floods aren't dealt with, where the heat is too much to deal with, where if you're a Black person, you live in a concentrated Black area of a city, it's much likely to have green areas or trees, and thus the average heat in the summer can be 5 to 10 degrees hotter. Simply living in an African-American neighborhood, 5 to 10 degrees hotter, and heat causes all kinds of health problems. So the notion of environmental justice was born, and a few years later, President Bill Clinton issued an executive order, like Biden's, pretty much the same, saying that government agencies should take into account environmental justice in their rulings. And at one point, the head of the EPA refused a permit to yet another polluting facility that was going to be placed in Cancer Alley. Cancer, if people don't know that phrase, it refers to the area, the 80-mile stretch between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, where there are countless plastic factories, petrochemical factories, extraction factories, just toxic facilities of all kind. And people are still resisting those places, those facilities. In 2021, a woman, I'm blocking on her name, local retired special education teacher, organized St. James Parish against yet another toxic facility and won and stopped this. So she got a Goldman Environmental Prize, which is a good deal of money given to on-the-ground environmental activists. Justice means people get what they deserve. Justice means people are treated fairly, treated equally. What is justice in regard to climate? So let's take a difficult question. Some years ago, some time at this point, there's the World Council of Churches, which is an umbrella organization of Protestants. The World Council of Churches used to, I imagine it still does, send observers and people to give talks and stuff at global climate meetings. The kind of global climate meetings where governments make commitments and give reports, all this kind of stuff. So at this point, I forget the guy's name, he was a German Protestant. He came to this global meeting with the idea of convergence, which reminisces of some of the slides we saw at the beginning that Terry showed. Convergence of what? Convergence of the average amount of greenhouse gases put into the atmosphere by people of every nation. So the average amount put into the atmosphere by, let's say, people in this room or on this Zoom, me who commutes from Boston to Worcester, which is an hour each way, you who do whatever it is you do, hope you ride a bike, I'm too old, should converge with that of the people in Bangladesh. Now, why is that an issue of justice? Well, let's ask ourselves. We are very rich in this country, even the poor people in this country compared to most of the poor people in this country compared to people in Bangladesh. The poor people in Bangladesh are much wealthier. They have much more. Why is it unjust for us to go about our lives, turning on our light bulb, turning on the heat, driving, eating meat, which is a terrible contribution to global warming? Why shouldn't we? After all, we're here and they're there. We're rich and they're poor. Now, some people will say it's racist, but some people say, well, we're rich because we're better. We're white, we're European, we're more advanced. That's why. Other people will say we're rich because we exploited them. So it's a long argument. But one thing can't be said is that we deserve to pollute them because we're better. Why do we have the right to pollute them? Right? So this is a serious question of justice. Maybe some people are rich because they're better, smarter, whiter, whatever. But nobody has the right to make some other people suffer for their form of life. Not that I can see. So the issue of climate justice is very severe. It's both severe within the United States because poor people, black people, brown people, red people will suffer more than the middle and upper classes. And certainly they'll suffer much less than the fabulously rich who can protect themselves from a great deal. Until there's no more food and then the people that the rich people have hired to protect them turn their own guns on the rich people and take their food. But until that happens, it's going to be unequal. It's going to be unequal. And that's the problem of climate justice. On the one hand, it's very clear. It's very clear that somebody's livelihood or life or house or medical care, none of these things should be swept away in a flood, or if they are, they should be repaired. And they shouldn't be more repaired because the community is white than it is for the people if the community is black. How could we possibly justify that? Not unless we're incredibly racist. I mean, we are incredibly racist, but this would be a really hard one to swallow for anybody. So we have the idea of climate justice. Can we talk about the fundamental issue of racial inequality in terms of, let's call it quality of life, in terms of basic conditions of living in this country, without addressing the fundamental economic inequality which is supported and essential to capitalism? After all, it might be argued, well, yeah, look, the environment is worse for black people who are generally at a lower economic level than white people, certainly not only in terms of income, but even more in terms of wealth. They live in crummier houses. Their streets are not as good. Their schools are not as good. Their health care is not as good. Why shouldn't their environment be terrible also? After all, this is a stratified society. We make noise about equity. We make noise about it. But the levels of economic inequality continue to get worse and worse, certainly over the last 40 years. Have gotten worse. Is there a way out of that? Is there a way to reorder the economic structure of society such that the engines of industrial production are geared towards equality, geared toward justice. That's the fundamental question. We can argue about this neighborhood or that neighborhood, this bill or that bill, but the fundamental structures of our society are geared towards inequality, and racial inequalities fits into that. Just fits into that as a justification, as an excuse. If we want to do something for climate justice, it will be, I believe, virtually impossible without making some moves towards the control of, the reining in of, the management of corporate power, which again is very difficult because corporate power equals political power. Most of the people in the government, certainly most of the people in the Congress, are pretty much employees of the people who give them money so that they can have campaigns. And who gives them the most money? The Republican Party 25 years ago wasn't so crazy, wasn't into climate change denial. There were Republican senators co-sponsoring environmental legislation with Democratic senators. And in the early 2000s, the Koch brothers, K-O-C-H, big coal magnates, incredibly wealthy, they said, this doesn't look good. And they spent about $700 million supporting in primaries Republican political candidates who were into climate denial. That's who they supported. And those people won. And now you have an entire political party, which pretty much denies the severity of climate problems and all the other environmental problems as well. Where did the Koch brothers get their money? From coal. How do you rein in the political power of the unimaginably wealthy without making a dent in the essential capitalist structure of this nation? That's a real problem. You don't have to do it all at once. Every small step, which if one continued with it, is a good step in that direction. And it's clear that when Donald Trump became president, one of the first things he did was just toss out as many environmental regulations as he could, including the ones where if you mine on a mountaintop for coal, for instance, mountaintop removal, which is not, I mean, we think of a coal mine, I used to think of a coal mine, as sort of dig down into the earth. No, they just take the top off the mountain. And the environmental effects on the surrounding area are staggeringly bad. So he undid a regulation which said the coal companies are liable for the pollutants that go into the streams. He took that away. Pollute what you want. So without the aim of control, using the government to control the corporation, now this is hard because corporations have an incredible amount of power over the government, but the government also has to answer to the people to some extent. Without it, they lose legitimacy, which creates all kinds of social problems. Look at the Supreme Court now, losing legitimacy. So the aim of climate justice, I am suggesting, must be focused on using the government to control corporations in defense of human beings, all human beings. And if possible, there must be some recognition of the unequal effects, the unequal vulnerability of poorer communities, especially communities of color, to this. At the same time, the recognition of environmental racism and the corollary environmental justice, once you get rid of the environmental racism, then you get some environmental justice, should not obscure the fact that the gradients of income, you make $20,000 a year, you're very poor. You make 40, you're poor. Make 80, you still feel like you're just scrabbling to get ahead, right? You want to try to find policy proposals that include as many people as possible and not exclude people, because every environmentalist needs every other environmentalist. There just aren't enough of us not to do it that way. Along with the environmental crisis, there is the crisis of politics. And what the crisis of politics is the modern rise of fascism, not just in the United States, but throughout the globe. Now, fascism is a fancy word. I'll just simplify it by saying it's a political program, and when it gets in power, a political reality with a number of fairly clear recurring features. One is authoritarianism, attacks on civil rights, attacks on anything resembling a free press, which may come with libel laws or may come with simply shooting journalists. 50 to 60 environmental journalists are murdered every year, a lot of them in Latin America, but in other areas as well. Somebody's blocking my face with a screen. I don't know why that, there we go. Fascism always requires an enemy, at least one enemy. For the Nazis, it was the Jews and also the left. For the Republican Party, it's LGBTQ people, trans people, immigrants, and Marxists. Now, my first 3 books I did on Marxism, so I'm sort of delighted to find out that Marxists are a real threat to America now, because I thought I was completely irrelevant. So I'm back in fashion. So in India, which has turned fascist, it's Muslims, it's Russia, it's anybody who disagrees with Putin, and also the homosexuals and all that stuff that has been imported from the West, according to Putin, people who aren't religious. Yeah, you have to have an enemy. Fascism spells the end of political life in the sense of politics being an arena where people get to represent their concerns, talk about their values, make an appeal to shared concerns to the whole community. If you think of politics as that, fascism spells the end of politics. It's the iron boot, which comes down. We saw it, we've seen it in Russia. People who said that what they were doing in Ukraine was a war, they've been arrested, they'll go to jail. The first person, a woman in Wuhan, China, when she heard about COVID, she stood up and said, well, there's a problem here with the virus. She's never been heard from since. And you have attempts, certainly by the Republican Party in the United States, to silence opposition, to silence talk about homosexuality and transgenderism, and to silence talk of the environmental crisis. Years ago, I forget who was the governor of Florida, passed a rule saying if you worked for the state of Florida, you could not use the phrase climate change. Couldn't use it. When George W. Bush was president, scientific reports about pollution in the Great Lakes was censored, and any relationship to chemicals which came from corporations that supported the Republican Party, thrown out. So simultaneous with the environmental crisis, we have a crisis of politics, and they converge in that virtually all fascist regimes are supporters of fossil fuels. Some people call it fossil fascism. They are in bed with the fossil fuel producers, partly because there's so much money that the fossil fuel companies make. As I said, $200 billion of profit in 1 year, that these short-term monetary gains equal short-term political power for fascists, and therefore the pursuit of climate justice is simultaneously the pursuit of an open democratic system. Now, it's very hard to have an open democratic system when 1/10 of 1% of the population controls 40% of the wealth, or whatever the details are. But it's a lot different to have that than to be, stand up against some policy or against some polluter and end up getting murdered. So there's a difference, and we have to hold on to that difference and keep pushing for openness, for responsibility, for the right to dissent, and for the ability for people to make their voices heard. It's not surprising that when environmentalists of any kind get too active, like the people who tried to shut down the Keystone Pipeline in North Dakota, when they get too active, more draconian laws are passed so that if you interfere with a pipeline, you're convicted of terrorism and sent to jail for 10 years. Or if you try to do a video of what goes on in a slaughterhouse or one of these horrible industrial food places, you can be arrested, not allowed to do it. Or there's something called SLAPP, S-L-A-P-P, all in capital letters, which are laws which allow people that you have shown to be polluters, they can countersue you and say that you're costing them too much money. So simultaneous with our concern with global climate justice for the poor, in Bangladesh, in Africa. You saw terrible pictures of these people. They have no water. They have no water. And there's no 7-Eleven where they can go buy a bottle. There's no government trucks dropping off gallon jugs of water. They just don't have any water. Keep in mind also that the effects of fossil fuel production, yes, there's this huge amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere. There's methane, which escapes when you take natural gas out of the earth, which doesn't last as long in the atmosphere as CO2, but is a much more intense greenhouse gas. I forget the percentage, but it's worse than CO2. It's also just the production itself. The Ogoni region of Nigeria, high oil producing area, incredible amount of pollution. You can't just take the oil out, it's going to be nice. You have all kinds of byproducts, you have production problems, you have leaks, it's a mess. And so the air and the water are being poisoned. And again, these weren't people who could just turn on a tap. They wanted river, they went to the river, but the river was poisoned. They're poisoning their own children. So they went out to the road, they tried to stop the workers from the oil facilities to come in. So the oil, people owned the oil facilities, which were European and American companies, sent thugs to beat the hell out of them. So they got armed. So there was violence. What else can you do in a situation like that? You can't move somebody else, someplace else, any more than the people in Cancer Alley can sell their homes in this incredibly polluted air. So the problem of climate justice can lead actually to armed conflict because lives are at stake. Lives are at stake, sometimes in the most immediate of ways. Now, I just want to complicate this issue, which is bad enough, complicate it one more time. As I've said, the effects of fossil fuel extraction are polluting and damaging, along with the effects of burning the fossil fuel. But they're not just damaging to humans. They're not just damaging to humans. In the northeast corner of the Gulf of Mexico, in the last several years, they discovered a new kind of whale, now called the Gulf of Mexico whale. And heavy-duty oil extraction there in the water, oceanic extraction area, wells. There's leaks. There's an incredible amount of noise, which is very damaging to whales. It's poisoning the whales. It's rapidly reducing them to near extinction. Global warming is lessening the snowpack in the Arctic region. That's devastating to certain kinds of caribou, devastating to the wolverines, which are like a large, you people in Michigan know what wolverines are, right? It's a large weasel-like animal, the largest of the weasel-like family. The environmental crisis and the climate crisis is not just about human beings. Not just about human beings. It's too hot. The birds are dropping dead off the trees in Mexico City, just from the heat. Just from the heat. The eggs hatch too soon because it's warm too soon. The plants haven't flowered yet, so the new baby birds don't have anything to eat. The animals are going higher and higher up the mountain because it's cooler, higher up the mountain. And then they're at the top of the mountain, and still it's getting warmer. Does that make any difference? Is that climate justice or climate injustice? If it's climate racism when it's done to people of color, is this climate anthropocentrism, taking human beings as the center? Do we care that biodiversity is dropping so rapidly that in some places the insect population is down by 2/3? Not just from global warming, it's also from habitat loss and from pollution, but global warming is part of it. Do we care that we're killing the other forms of life on this planet? 60 years ago, Rachel Carson wrote the first popular modern book on the environmental crisis called Silent Spring. Why Silent Spring? Because the birds would eat the insects. The insects have been poisoned with DDT. The birds would die from the DDT, and there wouldn't be any birds. Silent Spring. Those of us who are old in this room or on this Zoom know that there used to be more birds and more insects. Don't we all know that? Haven't we noticed? We have written our civilization on the backs of the poor, on the backs of the exploited, and on the backs of the other forms of life on this planet. People will at times ask me when I give yet another one of these depressing talks, will ask me, what can I as an individual do? What can I as an individual do? And there are certainly in the bookstores or online, there used to be bookstores and now everything's online, 50 ways to save the planet, all that sort of thing. My answer is simple. As an individual, you can join with other individuals and create and sustain political movements, right? It is only when people massify themselves, come as a significant activated mass, that things can change. Within that setting, people certainly can vote en masse, people can talk en masse, people can demonstrate en masse, people can commit civil disobedience en masse, people can use the courts. There are all these court cases now. I just found out there was one in Hawaii. I knew some time ago, I believe it was Montana, maybe even Idaho, where high school students sued the state government for violating the state government by not protecting their right to a safe and clean environment. And they were specifically focused on fossil fuels, but they had other environmental concerns mixed in. So one can do that. One can raise the issue of the environmental crisis broadly and the climate crisis more particularly in every setting. Imagine if we were at war, like the Second World War, the First World War, with an implacable enemy who will stop at nothing to destroy our civilization. Would we be talking about much else? Would we be talking about, the Super Bowl or what, some movie somewhere or some microaggression? No, we'd be talking about the war. We'd be devoting our energies as much as we could possibly to winning that war. Well, sadly, the war is on. The forces that are implacably moving to virtually undermine our entire civilization are at work. For the most part, they are getting stronger. Can we resist? How seriously we can take it in our homes, in our churches, in our universities, in our shops, everywhere. I know that I have for 30 years that I've been doing work on the environmental crisis. People have dismissed me as the environmental nag, the guy who's depressed. If you're not depressed, you haven't been paying attention. It's easy to dismiss people like that. And who wants to hear it? It's too frightening. But only if we can overcome the fear is there a chance of doing something, saving something, protecting someone, bringing some community into a more just situation. That's the task. Is it daunting? Yes. Humanity has never faced such a complicated and absolutely necessary social transformation. If you think of the civil rights movement of the late 50s and the 60s, it was difficult, it was dangerous, people died, they were shot, their homes were blown up, a church was blown up, killing four little black girls. Terrible things happened, but the issues was not complicated. Let people of color vote. Let them register to vote. Let them sit down on the bus. Let them into a restaurant. Stop beating them. Stop, cursing them in the street. All the kinds of things that were happening. Those are issues that any 10-year-old can understand. Again, dangerous and difficult, but not hard to understand. Climate, how are we going to get somewhere, meet people's reasonable needs while making the transition to renewable energy? How are we going to heat people's homes, for instance? So it's complicated. So it's difficult. But that doesn't mean we don't have some ideas already, people thinking about it already, people working for it already. Doesn't mean we haven't had some victories. There's a guy who worked for years and years and years, and he mobilized the effort to have every United States postal truck be electric by 2026. That's a victory. That's a victory. There are people who are trying to get solar energy really integrated, get people doing the technical work and also people doing the social and the legal work to get it fully integrated, that's a victory. When President Biden says, yes, we have to take into account environmental racism and environmental justice in everything we do, that's a victory. It's not impossible. It's not impossible to win a few. In the long run, what's important is not to know we're going to win. In the long run, it might not even be worthwhile to spend much time thinking, are we going to win? Because we don't know. There's a sort of sheltering ignorance that's very comforting. We don't really know. We may not have much hope. I don't have much hope. But we can still manage some courage to give love right now, to give love to the people who are suffering injustice, to give love to the mass of people who are suffering from climate change and environmental pollution of all kinds, to give love to the other species with whom we're sharing this precious planet. At the best, we can give love, just as you can give love to a sick person. And if God forbid, your mother or father or some beloved relative were very sick in a hospital, nurse comes and says, there's not much hope, better get her affairs in order. Would you want to spend all your energy thinking, what's the future going to hold? What's the future going to hold? No, you'd want to go into this person's room, hold their hand, sing to them, stroke their hair. We can do that to the planet. And on this planet are wolverines and caribou and fish and trout and robins and human beings, our fellow human beings. We can give love as we focus that energy of love into a social transformation so that our modern civilization is no longer destroying and poisoning ourselves and the rest of creation. Let your eyes gently close. Focus your attention and ask yourself, is there anything from this little talk you heard that you particularly want to remember? And is there anything that you particularly want to inquire into further? And just let your mind rest on your breath. Inhale and exhale. And very slowly and gently open your eyes. Thank you very much. If there are questions or comments, I'll be glad to hear them.
Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, my name is Ray Hall. I'm from Flint, Michigan. And I would like to invite you to the University of Michigan, Flint to speak and host you here, if possible. Work this out to the UNA to get you here to Flint. You spoke on everything that we're doing here right now.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not hard to find. Just send me an email and we can talk about it. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Roger, very much. Let's see what kind of questions we might have first in the room here. And then we'll see if there's some coming in. Put them in the chat and we'll get to those. Are there questions? Okay, right here.
Yes, thank you, Roger. My question is around how can you elaborate on how we can work against the political system that we're fighting with right now and be effective at overcoming that?
Well, if I was sure of the answer to that, I'd be a lot more powerful and rich than I am already. I think, number one, solidarity is very, very important. We must absolutely pick and choose between what issues are sort of absolutely non-negotiable and which issues we can accept differences. Take a very live, difficult issue now, the issue of abortion rights. Now, I've always supported abortion rights, but But here, let's suppose I'm coming across some woman who's a nun who has worked with refugees and has worked on climate change and has worked on economic inequality, but she doesn't think abortion is moral. Now, do I have to argue about that with her? Or can we both go to the demonstration about climate change? I would hope for the latter. That's the first thing I would think. Solidarity is absolutely critical. The ruling class is very unified. And so resistance, I mean, I can tell Marxist terminology because I'm a part of Marxist. So that our solidarity is very important. That's number one. Number two, we have to combine a sense of the transformation with a sense of how that transformation affects people. Classic example from many years ago, there was a bird in parts of the Oregon forest which was endangered. And so it was, at least it appeared as if the Environmental Protection Agency, the Endangered Species Act, had to decrease the amount of logging. So the loggers were furious, and they blamed the environmentalists. Actually, Japan had brought up a lot of the forests and mechanized the logging process, and that's what put them out of work. But that was the idea. So you have an idea, yes, we have to cut down on the logging, but we have a certain amount of funds which we're going to use to retrain the loggers to other professions. They might not want other professions, but you show some kind of concern for the cost of the transition. The cost of the transition will be enormous. I mean, I don't know how many people who took care of horses were put out of business in the first years of the 20th century, right? All of a sudden, horses out of date. It's all cars. Now, that's a fundamentally big change. If we want as much, quote, ordinary working class, lower middle class people to be part of this movement, we have to make it clear that we care about that, that's important to us. Number three, unlike other political movements, we cannot play around and we cannot indulge in self-righteousness. As a man, I was out of the United States. I was actually away from the Western world when the second wave of feminism hit the late 60s, early 70s. And I came back and feminism was in process. And I was very impressed by the ideas. I had an authoritarian father. So, not liking toxic masculinity came easily to me. So I read the stuff. I'm an intellectual. I read a book, and that was easy. And I went for it. So do my share of the dishes, get up in the middle of the night to feed the baby, don't make sexist jokes. Of course, absolutely no sexual coercion, see women in all kinds of positions of power. You do all that kind of stuff, you consider yourself a feminist man. All of us above the absolutely lowest income level are part of the environmental crisis. I drive a car. I eat food from the supermarket, et cetera, et cetera. I bought cotton shirts without noticing whether or not they're organic. Cotton is the most more pollution for cotton than anything else that's produced. So we cannot be self-righteous. So if somebody says, I stand with my pickup truck and my gun and my red meat, the idea is to talk respectfully to people with whom we disagree. That's really hard. That's really hard. It's a lot easier to just despise them for fools and scoundrels. But you can't build a mass movement. You want as many people as possible. It's a very interesting study of the political struggles around Yellowstone Park, where you had kind of old rancher types, sort of masculine cowboys, horses, guns, all that kind of stuff. And you had the new kind of hippie types moving in who were, trying to protect the buffalo and at one with Mother Earth, and you had the kind of conflicts like that. And you also had oil industry, which is doing extraction on the outside, mineral extraction. And there was a lot of conflict between them, but they did find one issue, which had to do with what was going to happen to an area in which the buffalo used for pastures. And they worked together. Can we find some way to work together, even with people who, rednecks or anti-environmentalists, because the potential is there. It's clear that the evangelical community in the South, the Southern Baptists, they are for the most part anti-environmental. Yet they had their own environmental group called the Evangelical Environmental Network, which did some very interesting campaigns. And to some extent, the Southern evangelical community split over this because one group of them, one guy, the leader, I'm blocking out his name, was very high up in the group. He was very strong. on environmental commitments for Southern evangelical, black suit, black tie, Bible under the arm, though not old washed up old hippies like me. So that's the other thing. Don't keep looking for alliances. And I told the story about the churches because I don't know what crowd it is here that I'm addressing. I think it's still underdeveloped, the way in which secular political movements or groups or organizations or little clubs or whatever can join up with a local religious organization. Religious pronouncements on the environment are far ahead of any other group in most of the world's religions. Not Orthodox Jews, not most of evangelical Christians, not certain Catholic groups in Africa, but a lot of them are very there. With the Pope, very, very strong on environmental questions. Look at the head of Orthodox Christianity, 500 million Orthodox Christians, very strong on environmental issues, so forth. So reach across every border you can, making the case in the most inclusive way possible, not in the most antagonistic way possible, not in the most contemptuous way possible, but in the most engaging way. I say environmentalists should be the most friendly, smiling, pleasant people who look like they have good digestions and a good sex life. And then people will want to come to our meetings. People who are angry and nasty, that's not very inviting. And so all you get is other angry, uptight people. And that's no way to do politics. Now, I will say in my experience, people who do environmental work are very nice people. And I think it's because our focus is not on one human group against another human group. Even if that's justified, it's not one human group against another human being. It's for the health of the planet, for the health of all life. I think with that as our horizon, we're more likely to be pleasant people and less likely to be driven by the ego that we see so paramount in many, unfortunately, left organizations. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
It hit the point very, very well. Another question from here? Here we go.
Thank you. More like an observation, and maybe you can talk me out of this,
Okay.
off this cliff that I find myself on. You pointed out very well that I think that we have the knowledge, the technology, we have whatever we need to handle the problems that we have. We've created them, we can handle them. What we don't have is time. And it strikes me that humans and the earth has handled situations like this, maybe not quite this drastic, but in the past, but it's basically they've had 100 years to do it or 50 years to do it, to change minds, to build the critical mass, to build the political, and there we get into the problem, build the political wherewithal to do it. We don't really have that much time, apparently. I mean, you're saying 80 months, that's really not much time at all. I mean, this really could be the one that does us in.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think we're talking about the end of the human race. I do think we are.
You don't think so?
No, I think what would happen would be a severe lessening of what we call modern civilization. I think there'll be a severe loss of life. The current population might go down by half, 2/3.
At least.
I think we go to much more decentralized form of life. Now, how much even a decentralized agriculture, sort of direct agricultural community can survive, given what we've done to the climate, I don't know. And even more what we've done with plastic and pharmaceutical pollution. Because pharmaceuticals are in everything, plastics and everything. That's what fossil fuel companies are doing. They're taking their money out of fossil fuels and putting them in plastic, because that's what, that's where plastics come from. And I think the numbers are like 30 billion tons of plastic now, and they're going to ramp it up to 60 billion tons of plastic. So
once the human population starts to decline, that brings in a whole new concept. The world is based on the population that we have now. If you cut it in half, all of a sudden, things are very, very different. The transportation systems we have, everything is going to be extremely different.
Yeah, no, it will be extreme. I mean, I think that's a optimistic viewpoint, because the distance between the ordinary person in most regions of the world, not all, but most regions of the world, certainly throughout the United States, the vast majority of people, the distance between us and being able to sustain ourselves with a subsistence form of living I can't do it. I don't know if anybody here can do it. Grow my own food, keep myself warm in a Massachusetts winter. No, I can't. I will die. And a lot of other people will die. But it is still possible for subsistence living at a much lower level than we've had it to be possible. So that's what I say. I don't think it's the end of the human race, though, you know, many other species might rejoice at that thought. But I think that the question is, will modern civilization with computers and cell phone towers and modern medicine and radioactive treatments for people with cancer and jet planes, all those kinds of things, are they going to be able to continue? When the winds get really bad, what's going to happen to all the cell phone towers? Well, they'll blow down. And then what? And then what? Well, how much can we rebuild when the destruction is at the level? If it gets too hot and the crops fail, what will we eat? Can't eat oil. So I could join you on that, Cliff, but I don't sort of, I can walk you back down. But again, you know, the question is not what's going to happen in the future. I think the moral question and the spiritual question is, what can I do today to share some love with the beings with whom I share the planet?
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question before Roger has to depart for other engagements.
Yeah.
Maybe we can take a question from somebody online if you want to raise a hand, and we'll let you, we'll unmute you to ask a question. Let's see, we got one coming there. Going once, going twice.
Oh, there's something in the chat.
Okay. I said, Tom Stanton wanted to suggest something or say something. So Tom, we're going to unmute you. You can have the last question here.
Well, thank you, Terry. I was wanting to see who from Gluna or who on the call is interested in working on these issues together. I've been working on them a long, long time. Right now, I'm in the process of sending a proposal to the U.S. Department of Energy for the special Justice 40 energy equity planning activities and energy equity progress in jobs and so forth. So I was wondering if you would find it appropriate for me to share those things with the audience somehow. I'm particularly curious about the person who spoke up from Flint. Yes, would Flint like any kind of help, and what kind of help would they like?
Yeah.
Why don't we have them put their emails in the chat so they can connect each with that, and we'll make sure that you guys get connected with that. Roger, let me let you finish up with one last, any closing thought that you might have before you have to go. Any
Okay.
particular one of your books you want to sell?
Well, you know, you can look me up. If you don't want to read the heavy philosophy stuff, there's a novel called The Sacrifice Zone, which I'm quite partial to. The Sacrifice Zone. It's a novel about the lives of environmental activists, and a sort of structural similarity between the environmental crisis and opiate addiction. The Sacrifice Zone is what it's called. Listen, thank you, all of you, for being interested. Those of you who have been working on this, you know, on behalf of the rest of life on Earth, thank you very much. You know, let's give the love we can and save the lives that we can and appreciate that we were ever here. So thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Be well, everybody. Go in good health.
Okay. We also want to do a couple other things here before we close off for the evening. First off, I want to invite Mary Flores up here to speak real quickly about joining the illustrious group called Gluna. And Mary, you want to share some information about how people can do that?
Thank you. Well, I'm glad I wrote down a few words, because that was just a lot to think about. I really appreciated all that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us at our Java Cafe today. I always appreciate everything I learn at them, and I hope you do too. If you're a member of our association, thank you. We're GLUNA, the Greater Lansing United Nations Association. Your participation helps us make these events possible. If you're not a member, please go to gluna.org. You can click on the Join Us button and make sure that you put that you would like to be a member of GLUNA when you join the United Nations Association. And we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Thank you so much. Thanks, George.
Thanks, Mayor. We also like to give people some things they might want to consider doing to follow up on what we might have learned today. And Roger gave us plenty to think about. But last week in the state legislature, in the Senate, where something was created, I think we have something called the Clean Energy Future Plan, put forward by quite a few senators. It covers bills SB 271 to 277. We're going to show you these slides real quick to give you a rough idea of this. If you type in to Google Clean Energy Future Plan Michigan, you will see all this in some detail. The bill numbers give you a lot more detail if you want to go further than that. And you'll probably be able to find some folks that are working on this. We've just become aware of it ourselves, but it does show promise for making substantial changes of the kind that we think are necessary, and our legislators need to hear from us. So those of you share with those around the state, your neighbors, your cousins, your family that might be in another city, in another district. We got to let them know that we have a chance to do this right now. And as you heard from others, we're in a pretty tense situation in terms of deadlines and meeting what the IPCC says we have to do in the next bunch of years. Is that the last slide? I think it is. Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to remember. There's something else we're supposed to do here. Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you. I did mention in my opening remarks that we, in preparing a program for today, that we looked at trying to find some short videos that kind of got to parts of this that might induce one to think more deeply about climate justice. I give you a brief intro to each one of these real quick, but these will be available for you to look at. The TED Talk that you see up here on Pakistan was, as you can see, we have the link on them, was a talk by a woman from Pakistan about what took place there last fall with many engaging pictures and things. It's a very moving story, and it shows really the impact in ways that others don't. Right here is Mary Robinson to the right, former Prime Minister of Ireland, President of Ireland, and the former head of the UNHCR, who is now, I think, president of a group called the Elders, which was formed by Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and others, and Jimmy Carter, notable people from around the world who work together to try to engage around the big issues facing humanity on this planet. She gave the Wege lecture just last month up at the University of Michigan. This is not that talk, but there's some things in it that are very similar. The next slide, a very short but very lucid discussion from a philosophical point of view from a philosopher in Canada, and then an animated version on climate justice. Any of these would be useful if you want to share with others, and we'll make those available. They will be up on our website. Yeah. So with that, I just want to thank everybody that's here in the room and everybody that joined online for this. We will get this. This has been recorded, so we will end up loading the video up for those who could not make it. I think it was worthwhile. At least I learned some things, and I'm fairly knowledgeable about a lot of this stuff, but he had me thinking, which is what we want to do. And now we need to do some action. So drive safely tonight for those of you who drove here. Those that are sitting in your living room or your office, put your feet up, go to the refrigerator, get a cold beverage, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. If I can have some assistance from a couple of guys before you leave, we're going to roll some of these tables out and set up some chairs for the next group that's coming in here tomorrow so that Bruce doesn't have to do it all. Don't have to do it right now. We don't have to rush out the door. But if you can hang around for a few minutes, that'd be fun. What's that? Did I say guys? Oh, geez. Anybody can help. Yeah, thank you. Forgive me. Do all the chores need to get.